Hello, Ina. I can quickly introduce you because you sent me a few lines about yourself. Basically, I know already that you're the professor of English literature and culture at the University in Basel, which is wonderful. I know that you work on Shakespeare because we're going to hear more about that, more of that tomorrow in Freiburg, if I'm not mistaken. That's wonderful. And you're interested in the early modern period generally and the construction of Englishness also in the 1930s and 40s, which is a very specific period in literature and film of that time. And you're doing also gender and spatial studies. You're currently working on a project on the Swiss-British relations in the 17th and the 18th centuries. Which I got a glimpse of a few weeks back in Basel when you were telling me about all of these Jacobite pretenders, which is really interesting. And you've done publications that include an edited collection of called Shakespeare and Space. That is the space part. And you did a wonderful conference on Brexit, and you published The Road to Brexit, a cultural perspective on British attitudes to Europe, Manchester University Press, and now it's available in paperback also. And I know you're a Swiss citizen who votes, which is also something nice to know.
Yes,
and that's about it. If there's anything else you want to tell us, Ina, please do. And otherwise, the floor is yours.
Not really. I mean, there's also the website, so you can always, if you really want to see more of my publications, you can have a look at the website at our university. But I'm very happy that I can contribute to this series of lectures here, and I've chosen the topic Goblin Fruits, the gender and the Pre-Raphaelite Project, because the Pre-Raphaelite movement in the 19th century is a really interesting artistic and literary movement. And in recent years, gender has become more and more important for this movement. If you can just show us the next slide. Here is the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The three most important men who came together in this brotherhood are the artists Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt. And these three were inspired by a revolutionary spirit of the 1848 times, and they, if you could go back, yeah, thanks. And they decided that they wanted a new kind of art, a different kind of art, and they wanted to go against the art that was taught at the Royal Academy, especially by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And that was a very sort of conservative way of painting. And they wanted something new. They wanted a serious commitment to the study of nature. They wanted to express emotions and expression of ideas. They were fascinated with medieval culture too. And the reason why they call themselves Pre-Raphaelites is they wanted to go back behind the painter Raphael, who lived around the year 1500, a painter from Urbino. And the Pre-Raphaelites thought that this art was uncorrupted, it was beautiful, and later developments in art, such as mannerism, were kind of the wrong developments, and they wanted to go back to that purity and that preoccupation with biblical subjects and with mythological subjects and the Middle Ages, and also religious paintings and so forth. So that was their project, and they founded this brotherhood, the three of them, and some other friends as well. The subjects that they painted were medieval stories taken from the Arthurian legend, biblical motifs, and so on. And they were also inspired by the Romantic poets, so Blake, for example, and also John Keats. So this is, in a way, it's a very progressive movement, a forward-looking movement, but at the same time, and this is going to be my topic for today, they have a very problematic attitude towards femininity and towards women. So they used women, they painted women. You can see a picture here painted by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Persephone. They depicted women as ideals of beauty, as ideals of spirituality, and embodiments of an ideal. So that was the structural position of women in the Pre-Raphaelite project, to be objects of desire and embodiments, and in a way allegorical depictions of ideals of beauty and spirituality. And that didn't leave actual historical women a lot of room for maneuver. Persephone here is the Greek goddess of death, the underworld, and fertility. So this is a quite typical picture by Rossetti here. Rossetti himself was the son of an émigré Italian scholar and poet. This man was a professor of Italian at the King's College London. Rossetti came from a very educated and politically revolutionary household. His father had to leave Italy because he supported the Italian revolutionary movement, was also a Roman Catholic. So there is a quite interesting continental European background to Rossetti, and also to a certain extent to Millet, because he comes from Jersey and was very interested in France and French culture. So what these painters did when, because they wanted to paint from real life, when they spotted a woman they liked, a striking woman, they asked her to sit for them as models. And this often also led to affairs with these women who sat as models. And one of the most important models is Elizabeth Siddal. And she had a long affair with Rossetti. They were together for over 10 years, and then eventually he married her. But shortly after that, she committed suicide with an overdose of laudanum. If you could show us the next slide, please. This is a photograph of Elizabeth Siddal, one of these ideal beauties who Rossetti became infatuated with. And she was his model, and also a model for the other Pre-Raphaelites, but also a poet and painter in her own right. And she had this very difficult relationship with Rossetti. She gave birth to a dead child and had a postpartum depression, something that wasn't particularly well understood at the time. And she also had a quite severe laudanum addiction. And that was a particularly Victorian vicious circle. When people were in poor health, they very often took laudanum, and laudanum is a solution of opium in alcohol. So it's a very potent drug, and Siddal was addicted to laudanum. And it's also thought in secondary literature, the idea is expressed that she probably also poisoned herself with a so-called Fowler's solution. This is the other little bottle that I'm showing you here. This is a solution based on arsenic, which was supposed to make the skin very nice and white and smooth. So apparently she imbibed these rather toxic mixtures, and that was of course part of her tragedy, that she was unhappy with her lot. She was practically a drug addict, and it's only now, or in recent years, that people are seeing more of her own work as a painter and as a poet. I've given you a title here, My Lady's Soul, the Poetry of Elizabeth Siddal, edited with an introduction and notes by Serena Trowbridge. And Rossetti himself, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was very highly strung. He had many setbacks, and he tended to become very infatuated with his women, with his models, and particularly with Elizabeth. And he was absolutely devastated when he died. And it's one of these typically Victorian pre-Raphaelite anecdotes that when Elizabeth was buried, he buried the only copy of his poems with her. And then 7 years later, they had to exhume Elizabeth in order to retrieve the poems. And they did that actually in the absence of Rossetti. They opened the grave and took out the poems. And a friend of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's then invented the legend that when they opened the coffin, Elizabeth was completely untouched, and her auburn hair had kept growing, and the whole coffin was filled with this hair, you know. So I think it's this ghoulish fascination is, I think, really part of this particular culture there. So, and then his poems were published. So he was very devastated by her death, but at the same time, he always had affairs with other models, with other women, and that placed women like Elizabeth Siddal in a very difficult position. And feminist criticism has been trying to bring these women's own preoccupations and their own creative side to the fore. If you can show us the next slide, I think this is a very interesting comparison that we can make of a picture that Dante made with Elizabeth as a model. This is Beata Beatrix, and you can see how she's completely transfixed and beautiful, spiritual. She's looking up in this kind of sensual trance. So this is how he sees her. This is how he chooses to depict her. And on the right is a self-portrait that Siddal painted, which shows a woman with a very neat collar, very neat hair, a slightly pinched expression on her face, and also a look that she trains very critically on the viewer, really. So I think when you compare these two depictions of the same woman, this is very telling what Dante wanted to see and what she herself wants to project about herself and her looks. The next slide. They painted many pictures, the brotherhood of Siddal and other models, and this is a typical one by John Everett Millay, The Bridesmaid, one from the early years, 1851, where you can see how the hair particularly has this amazing erotic charge, you know, these abundant tresses, either very dark or this golden red that they just kept painting all the time. And in terms of style, what they did was they prepared the canvas and made it totally white and slightly wet, and then they painted with watercolor brushes, very thin, or used oil colors, but very thin, with watercolor brushes on that underground, which then led to a kind of luminous quality of these paintings. That it looks like they're really glowing from within. That was the effect that they wanted, especially for these women's faces, for their eyes, for their bodies, for their dresses, and for their hair in particular. So I want to also show you now two poems by Elizabeth Siddal. So because we want to move ahead a little and actually listen to the women writers and creative artists. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. This is one of Siddle's poems entitled Worn Out. And of course, it's always difficult to read poetry in an autobiographical way and to conflate the author with the speaker of the poem. But in much Romantic and Victorian poetry, this is one dimension of the work. So while it is an aesthetic product that has to be seen in its own right, it's also very tempting to see these poems also as expressions of what Siddle was going through. And here is this poem. Thy strong arms are around me, love. My head is on thy breast. Low words of comfort come from thee, yet my soul has no rest. For I am but a startled thing, nor can I ever be aught save a bird whose broken wing must fly away from thee. I cannot give to thee the love I gave so long, the love that turned and struck me down amid the blinding snow. I can but give a failing heart and weary eyes of pain, a faded mouth that cannot smile and may not laugh again. Yet keep thine arms around me, love, until I fall to sleep. Then leave me, saying no goodbye, lest I might wake and weep. So the speaker of the poem expresses this this frustration that even though the lover's arms are around her, still she's not able to give the kind of damaging love that that she used to be able to give. She has a failing heart, her eyes are in pain, the faded mouth can't laugh anymore, and she doesn't really even want to wake up anymore because this will lead to grief. And there's the constant fear of being forsaken, of being cast off and being cast away once youth and beauty have flown. Because for the Victorian women, given the double standard of sexual morality, it was always very dangerous for women to succumb to any temptations to enter into an affair with somebody, because that would taint them morally and they could always be cast aside. And the next poem, if you can just move to the next slide, this is almost like, I think, like a counterpart to the first one we looked at, taking the perspective of the man who looks at his lady. And it's called Lust of the Eyes. I care not for my lady's soul, though I worship before her smile. I care not where be my lady's goal, when her beauty shall lose its wile. Low sit I down at my lady's feet, gazing through her wild eyes, smiling to think how my love will fleet when their star-like beauty dies. I care not if my lady pray to our Father which is in heaven, but for joy my heart's quick pulses play, for to me her love is given. Then who shall close my lady's eyes, and who shall fold her hands? Will any hearken if she cries unto the unknown lands? So the speaker here is saying that he doesn't really mind what the condition of the lady's soul. He worships her body, he worships the smile, he worships the face, the beauty, knowing already that these are fleeting qualities and that once they are gone, he will be able to turn away from her. And he knows that he has her love. To me, her love is given. So he is in possession of her love. And the question is, when he turns away, who will console the lady? Who will fold her hands, and who will be there for her? So again, I think there is this fear of being forsaken and of being left behind. That comes across very strong in the poems of Elizabeth Siddle. Yeah, if you can move on to the next slide. I think the most iconic painting of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is actually one by John Everett Millais. This is Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Ophelia, who has gone mad for Hamlet when he rejects her. So after Hamlet has withdrawn his love from her, she becomes mad and she drowns herself in a river. And here we have this Ophelia floating, surrounded by flowers, as a corpse, as a dead woman. So in a way, this epitomizes really iconically the woman's situation in this pre-Raphaelite setup. And again, there is a kind of a typical gruesome pre-Raphaelite anecdote about how that picture was done, because Elizabeth Siddal lay in a bathtub full of water, and Millais forgot to reheat that water every once in a while, so the water became completely stone cold, and she was floating there for ages while he was painting, and she contracted pneumonia from that sitting, so she got really very ill. Which is in some ways very symbolic. And what I also find interesting, this iconic painting here, Ophelia, the beautiful dead body of the woman, is that it is still one of the posters that is sold most often, and many young girls buy this and put it on their walls, you know. So what does that say about girls' projections of femininity even to this day, you know, that they put the dead, beautiful Ophelia on their walls? Yeah, so here we have Elizabeth Siddal as Ophelia. And after Siddal's death, Rossetti, who had always had a number of affairs, he really became infatuated with a different woman called Jane Morris. If we could have the next slide, please. This is Jane Morris, photograph of Jane Morris. She was born Jane Burden, and they spotted her in a theater in 1857 and asked her to model. Rossetti became really completely infatuated with her beauty and with her looks. She also was a very talented creative person. So she was involved in craft. She made books and illuminations, painted illuminations, and she also did embroidery. You can see a bag here that she's supposed to have worked, that is exhibited in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And she modeled a lot for Rossetti. And again, that was a very difficult constellation, because a younger member of the Pre-Raphaelite group, William Morris, the writer and artist, utopianist, who also was instrumental for the arts and crafts movement, he was in love with Jane Burden and married her, and then but she was drawn to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and they entered into a kind of ménage à trois at Kelmscott Manor, because Jane had this sort of long-standing affair with Rossetti. If we can have the next slide, please. Here is Jane, a painting where Jane has modeled Astarte Syriaca, Venus Astarte. And you can see there this sort of mythological subject. And in this case, as in many other cases, Rossetti also wrote a poem to go with a picture. And this sonnet that goes with the picture emphasizes particularly the mystery of that beauty. Mystery, lo, betwixt the sun and moon, Astarte of the Syrians, Venus queen, ere Aphrodite was. In silver sheen her twofold girdle clasps the infinite boon of bliss, whereof the heaven and earth commune. And from her neck's inclining flower stem lean love-freighted lips and absolute eyes, that wean the pulse of hearts to the sphere's dominant tune. Torch-bearing, her sweet ministers compel all thrones of light beyond the sky and sea, the witnesses of beauty's face to be, that face of love's all-penetrative spell amulet, talisman and oracle, betwixt the sun and moon, a mystery. So again, Rossetti evokes this face as the ultimate expression of love's mystery, of beauty's mystery, of spirituality that is expressed in myth making or in human mythical stories, and it all concentrates around this face with the lips and the girdle down here around her waist, that is yeah, that also of course draws attention to her sexuality and the eroticism of her body. So here you can clearly see, you can clearly recognize Jane Morris. And this was deliberate in the Pre-Raphaelites because they wanted to paint from the real world and then transport the real into a kind of mystical, spiritual reality. So they start from a recognizable model and paint a portrait of sorts, and then give it an additional spiritual quality. Next slide. Just two more examples. So you can see here is an example from a classical period, the Roman Widow. This is a painting from 1874. And the other as well, 1874, the Damsel of the Sanct Grail. This damsel is a minor character in Malory's Morte d'Arthur. And in Rossetti's version, the damsel offers the chalice, the grail, to the knights rather than to Christ. So there is a sexual invitation there as well, as she's holding up the grail, that cup of promises. And I think in this case, in these two late paintings, 1874, the model is most probably Alexa Wilding, who was another of those Rossetti beauties here. Yeah, next slide. Here is a sonnet by Rossetti that epitomizes this approach to the soul's beauty that goes in a kind of Neoplatonic way via the female body. Under the arch of life, where love and death, terror and mystery guard her shrine, I saw beauty enthroned. And though her gaze struck awe, I drew it in as simply as my breath. Hers are the eyes which over and beneath the sky and sea bend on thee, which can draw by sea or sky or woman to one law, the allotted bondman of her palm and wreath. This is that lady beauty, in whose praise thy voice and hand shake still, long known to thee by flying hair and fluttering hem, the beat following her daily of thy heart and feet, how passionately and irretrievably, in what fond flight, how many ways and days. So this gives voice to the infatuation, to the worship at the shrine of Lady Beauty, and the attributes of the face and the flying hair and the fluttering hem that they painted dozens and hundreds of times ever anew. Next slide. Now, Gabriel Rossetti had a sister, Christina Rossetti, and she is in a slightly different position from these other women who were models for the Pre-Raphaelite brothers and who were also very often from a lower class, and where you have a kind of difficult connection of class and gender conspiring to sideline these women, because they often came from rather humble backgrounds and were then elevated and lifted up by the Pre-Raphaelite brothers. Christina Rossetti comes from that Rossetti family. She is the daughter of that same intellectual and artistic household. She held a very fervent Anglo-Catholic faith, lived her life according to strict religious principle, which also prevented her from marrying. She had a number of offers, but for religious doubts, nothing came to fruition really here. And she worked for long years as a volunteer in a penitentiary for fallen women. So she really wanted to help women who had fallen victim to the Victorian double standard, really, and reform them and help them and bring them back to society and to a better prospect in life. This is a pencil portrait by Dante Gabriel Rossetti of his sister. And it's interesting, the feminist critics Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar call her work an aesthetics of renunciation. So Rossetti, Christina Rossetti being very much someone who austerely emphasizes sacrifice and morality and virtue. So it's in some ways it's the complete opposite of what the brothers were doing in their lavish display of sensual beauty and connecting that to spirituality. She goes a really different way. Next slide, please. And one of the most famous sonnets that Christina Rossetti wrote actually voices quite a harsh critique of her brother's approach. It's called In an Artist's Studio. And it goes, one face looks out from all his canvases, one self-same figure sits or walks or leans. We found her hidden just behind those screens. That mirror gave back all her loveliness. A queen in opal or in ruby dress, a nameless girl in freshest summer greens, a saint, an angel. Every canvas means the same one meaning, neither more nor less. He feeds upon her face by day and night, and she with true kind eyes looks back on him, fair as the moon and joyful as the light, not one with waiting, not with sorrow dim, not as she is, but was, when hope shone bright, not as she is, but as she fills his dream. So what Rossetti is saying here is that her brother really has created a dream of these women, and especially I think she's referring her also to Elizabeth Siddal, who waited so long until she grew one with waiting. And his dream is this opulent dream of these queens and mythological figures in opal dresses and with their shining hair and their ever young and beautiful faces. And he doesn't see the reality. He doesn't see these women in their plight and with their problems and their drug addiction and all that, and their social drawbacks. But he looks at them and he sees his dream come true. And in a way, it's sort of doubly perfidious because he presents such a flattering portrait to these women of themselves. You know, it's like a kind of Pygmalion setup. He makes them so beautiful that they fall in love with their own depictions by him, you know, and in a way find it impossible to live up to their own ideals or the ideals that they embody in the paintings. And there's never a possibility to really reach that ideal for these women. So they see themselves depicted in a kind of reality that they can never attain. And this is this problem and this plight is beautifully expressed in a longer poem of Christina Rossetti's. And I would ask for the next slide now. And this is the poem that I also gave you to read if you liked, Goblin Market. And I also gave you a short article on absinthe. I'll come to that in a moment. So in Goblin Market, Christina Rossetti spells out the temptations that women are faced with. So there are two sisters, two girls who live together and who work their farm and are quite self-sufficient. But then these maids hear the goblin cries, and these goblins, small figures in the woods, they offer all sorts of beautiful, ripe, sweet fruit. And the temptation is to try these fruit. And of course, you can, in a way, allegorically read these fruit as the temptation of the male lover. So giving in to the sexual invitations that these goblins, that these men extend to the women. Morning and evening, maids heard the goblins cry, "Come buy, come buy." Apples and quinces, lemons and oranges, plump unpecked cherries, melons and raspberries, bloom-down-cheeked peaches, swart-headed mulberries, wild freeborn cranberries, crab apples, dewberries, pineapples, blackberries, apricots, strawberries, all ripe together in summer weather. Morns that pass by, fair eves that fly, come buy, come buy. Our grapes fresh from the vine, pomegranates full and fine, dates and sharp bullaces, rare pears and greengages, damsons and bilberries, taste them and try, currants and gooseberries, bright fire-like barberries, fig to fill your mouth, citrons from the south, sweet to tongue and sound to eye, come buy, come buy. Evening by evening among the brookside rushes, Laura bowed her head to hear, Lizzie veiled her blushes. Crouching close together in the cooling weather, with clasping arms and cautioning lips, with tingling cheeks and fingertips. So we get a long description here of all the wonderful, enticing, juicy fruits that, of course, have a very sexual connotation as well. And the invitation of the goblin men that is extended is, taste of my juice and suck my juices, and then this will be nice for you. And Laura, so of the two sisters, Laura is the one then who succumbs to the goblin's invitation. Yeah, just next slide, Sammy, if you will. Lie close, Laura said, pricking up her golden head. We must not look at goblin men. We must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots? Come by, call the goblins, hobbling down the glen. And then eventually Laura does listen to them. She succumbs to temptation, and she has nothing to pay the goblin men with. So she clips a lock from her hair. She clipped a precious golden lock. She dropped a tear more rare than pearl, then sucked their fruit globes fair or red, sweeter than honey from the rock. She sucked and sucked and sucked the more fruits which that unknown orchard bore. She sucked until her lips were sore, then flung the emptied rinds away, but gathered up one kernel stone, and knew not, was it night or day, as she turned home alone. So, and now the problem is, now that Laura has succumbed to the goblins, she cannot hear them anymore. So she longs for more of that juice. She wants to go back. And she can't find the goblin men anymore, because when they've once tempted her and she's addicted to them, they hide from her and they won't give her anything. And that, as I've explained earlier on, that is in a way a symbolic rendering of the problematic situation of women who entered into affairs with men, who outside wedlock, outside marriage, and who also became attracted to the bohemian life and to the the joys of creation and artistry, and also, of course, drugs. And it's I think this article that I gave you about absinthe is very interesting, because what Christina Rossetti does also in this poem is to invent a kind of counter cure, or a counter remedy that effects a cure against the addiction. And this is the wormwood, and wormwood is actually the substance from which absinthe is made, and it's a very bitter root, and it was a fashionable drink in 19th century Bohemian circles, and so there was an extract made from the wormwood, and this absinthe, which is also, by the way, produced in Switzerland, it was poured over a sugar cube into a glass of water, and then became this kind of milky substance, and mixed with alcohol. So this absinthe is an incredibly very strong alcoholic mixture, and it has that wormwood in it as well as a kind of pharmaceutical substance. And what the author of that wonderful article, Absinthe Makes the Tart Grow Fonder, I love that title, is that Christina Rossetti, in a way, amalgamates this notion of giving into the sexual invitations of men with drug addiction. So that becomes the same kind of dynamic, or a dynamic that is really intertwined. Being addicted to illicit sexuality, being addicted to absinthe, to laudanum as well, to drugs. And in the poem, the saving grace is the sister, because Lizzie, the sister, goes out to the goblin men, and she smears herself with the juice. The goblin men want to give her the juice as well. They want to tempt her as well. But Lizzie doesn't open her mouth. She just gets covered in the juice. And then she goes, and the goblin men get really angry. They kick her, they hit her. But she goes back smeared with this juice to her sister. And then her sister licks off this juice. And that functions as a kind of antidote and as a cure for the sick, for the addicted woman, and makes her well again. And so in this case, female solidarity and sisterly love salvages Laura and brings her back from the brink of destruction and death. And then at the end, these two women, these two loving sisters, have children of their own, and they tell their stories to their little ones about the joys of sisterly solidarity. And this is the final bit here I have. Laura would call the little ones and tell them of her early prime, those pleasant days long gone of not returning time, would talk about the haunted glen, the wicked, quaint fruit merchant men, their fruits like honey to the throat, but poison in the blood. Men sell not such in any town. Would tell them how her sister stood in deadly peril to do her good and win the fiery antidote. Then joining hands to little hands would bid them cling together, for there is no friend like a sister in calm or stormy weather, to cheer one on the tedious way, to fetch one if one goes astray, to lift one if one totters down, to strengthen whilst one stands. So this is the moral of the poem, that sisterhood, that sisterly solidarity that is in a way pitted against the corrupting influence of the drug and of the corrupting influence of men who will exploit these women's sexuality. And they give that message to their children as well, telling them the story of the quaint fruit merchant men and how you overcome them. And I think this is partly also what Christina Rossetti was feeling very strongly about when she worked in the penitentiary for falling women. You know, she was actively trying to help these women and do something for them. Next slide, please. And the Pre-Raphaelite brothers were also interested in this issue, especially in the early years. So this is a painting by William Holman Hunt called The Awakening Conscience, 1853. The model is Annie Miller, a barmaid. And here we can see this woman who is kept in a very lavish establishment by a lover here, who's fondling her, and they sit in front of the piano, and he's dallying with her, and suddenly she sees the peril which she is in, and the threat to her moral integrity, and she gets up as if she's kind of seen a ray from the light from the sky. And standing up from the lap of this man. Next slide. And this was also, this painting was an inspiration for Dante Gabriel Rossetti as well, who painted a picture of a fallen woman. It's called Found. It was begun in 1854, and he mentions also that he was interested in the awakening conscience by Hunt. And here you can see again this trademark red hair. I think this is Fanny Cornforth, the model in this case. And how the prostitute is cowering there on the street, and this man finds her and takes her up, and it's not entirely clear whether this is a kind of violent thing or whether he's rescuing her and helping her up. And in the background, you can see a symbolic white calf that is tied up there, and kind of like the sacrificial lamb, if you will. Yes, probably a lamb. So like the sacrificial lamb, to emphasize how this woman is fallen, how she is in need of salvation. Next slide. And Rossetti also drew another picture in 1854 where this is even more clearly expressed. It's called The Gate of Memory, and there you can see the shrunken, gaunt prostitute cowering in the shadows behind a wall and looking at the luminous scene of young girls, young and innocent girls, how they're dancing, how they're communing together, so innocent and so happy, and she can only look into her own past across the gulf of her own fallenness and debauchery, because of course due to the Victorian double standard, the blame for sexual sinfulness and adultery and prostitution fell on the women and not on the men, right? But here we have also Dante Rossetti in his earlier years preoccupied with fallen women, with the consequences of female subjugation and exploitation, and that becomes less of a theme with him in later years, when his pictures become more and more mythological and idealized. Next slide, please. And here is an illustration that he made for his sister's long poem Goblin Market, and there you can see the sisterly solidarity that is the antidote to this fate of the fallen woman. Here you have the two sisters lying arm in arm, and in this little ball there you can see the goblin men with walking in the night time, jumping around with their basket of fruits, and the sisters are in a way safe from them because they take care of each other. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to point you to two very interesting websites that are that were created by Stephanie Chatfield, who is one of the actually lay people who are very interested in the pre-Raphaelite sisterhood. So we're moving from brotherhood to sisterhood, and who have collected images and information. And you can check this out if you are interested. And there was also at the National Portrait Gallery an exhibition called Pre-Raphaelite Sisters in 2019, 2020. And this picture I'm showing you here is by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. It's called Exe Ancilla Domini. And the model here is his sister, so he painted her as the maid of the Lord, and in a way emphasizing her particularly stern religious attitude. He's showing her with a halo behind her head. So she is really the divine, the religious girl, the religious maid, who also has connotations of the Virgin Mary. Next slide is just the further reading. So if you are interested in following up these questions, there's a correspondence between Rossetti and Jane Morris, and there are various books by Jan Marsh, and Jan Marsh is a very important scholar for the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood. She is curator at the National Portrait Gallery, and she wrote about Lizzie Siddall as well, and Jane Morris. And then we have Lucinda Hawksley's Lizzie Siddall, The Tragedy of a Pre-Raphaelite Supermodel. Very interesting book. And yeah, here's also the essay by Shelley O'Reilly, Absinthe Makes the Tart Grow Fonder, that you could read if you wanted. So there is a lot around now, literature on these women, pictures, information that you can check out. And I think this will help you to get a bit more balanced picture of what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is all about, what their project was, and the good things that they did, and also at the same time the problems that were created by this sort of homo social group of men, and the way that they use these Victorian women. And you can learn more about the creativity of these sisters, and these women who were part of the Pre-Raphaelite cycle. Yeah, just the final slide, please. Here is a bit of absinthe, if you like, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to hear your questions and ideas.
Thank you very much, Ina. That was really interesting. Yes, I see a lot of hands. People who were very happy with this. Absinthe in Switzerland is usually from the Val de Travers, if I'm not mistaken, in Neuchâtel, and it was illegal for a long time. It's only been legalized fairly recently.
Yeah.
But I know that there was a lot of what the Americans would call moonshining happening in the Val de Travers, and you could always buy it there, from what I understand.
And the problem with absinthe is partly, of course, why it was blamed for so much illness and people going partly blind and hallucinating. Partly, from what I gather, it was the inferior alcohol. You know, if you have an 88% alcohol content, and this is very bad alcohol containing methanol and so on, then it's bound to be very detrimental. That isn't even maybe the fault of the wormwood root, but of the shitty alcohol. You know?
Yeah. Of course, no, I can imagine. I have a couple of questions here. Sarah Berazi, I see a hand up there too. And an unlocked microphone.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm actually currently working on the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and specifically photography.
Oh, right.
So because I don't know if you know a lot about photography. I'm working on Julia Margaret Cameron, whose work really inspired me in so many ways. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think the place of photography took in the Pre-Raphaelite movement and brotherhood? And this is a bit another question, which is a bit funny. I'm going to say, why do you think people never smiled in those photographies? Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I mean, this is a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on this, but it's very clear that they used photography. They also sometimes used it as a basis of painting. We also have photographs by Lewis Carroll, actually, the author of Alice in Wonderland, who was a great photographer and who also photographed some of the Pre-Raphaelites. Partly, I think that it's still the formality of the photographs, that they are not very casual. So it's a serious affair. That's why probably they don't smile, because they project a kind of very serious and dignified character. But
what about exposure time for photographs in those days? You know,
yeah, well, yeah.
keep,
I mean, I
keep
suppose
a smile going for 5 seconds is just much more difficult. You know, a natural smile, especially. You know.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But you know, in the case of the women, there's also something else. There is this idea that they are supposed to be so dreamy, and very often they are depicted as reclining, as resting, as dreaming, as sleeping, as dead, as lying there in this kind of state of transportation. And there isn't much, so to depict like an informal liveliness would be going against that kind of projection. And actually, in Siddle's case, the resting and the lying there was often sort of basically opium-induced kind of coma. So in that particular case, that is a consideration as well. But I think it has to do with the image that they wanted to project, partly the technical aspect that Sammy just mentioned, but then also the what do you want to project? You want to project something very ethereal and spiritual and very stylized still. I hope that. Have you got anything yourself that you would like to add to this, having worked on the photography?
Well, I've looked at a few articles. Surprisingly, not a lot of research mentioned that, but they do mention Lewis Carroll, the photographies he did, which were very interesting to analyze. But a lot of, from what I've read, is mostly because it would take a long time to get the shots. So they just, it was too difficult for them to just remain stoic and smiling for a long time. So they just eventually stopped. And I noticed how the photographies, that's more of a personal comment, the photographies were very gloomy, whereas a lot of the paintings were colorful and dreamy. For example, remember Ophelia, one of the most famous ones. And so there is this interesting contrast between those two forms of art that come together at this period of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That's true. And this is something that you couldn't actually do in photography at the time. So this is a very good point you're making, that photography is starting to take over from painting the element of a realist depiction of a person. But what you couldn't do was the riotous color. And these Pre-Raphaelites, that's one of their key preoccupations, that the color must be as brilliant and as striking as it possibly can. You know, that technique they were using of painting on the slightly wet canvas with oil very thin, and sometimes mixing gum into the color as well to make it even more glossy and more shining. So that's of course something that the photograph can't do.
And it's also what makes the Pre-Raphaelite paintings look so artificial a little bit to us today. There's an element of kitsch in there. You know, at least they invented it somehow.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. I've been struck by the formal quality of the Christina Rossetti poem. I mean, there are a lot of fascinating formal elements, that you can basically go through the whole gamut of prosody definitions and analyze this. And it's extremely rich, and also the sound patterns sometimes, alliterations and repetitions. It was extremely fascinating and fairly good quality, I think, actually.
Oh, yes. And I mean, Christina Rossetti is a very distinguished poet. I think this is less true of Elizabeth Siddal, who also had a different educational background, and she also didn't write that much. But Christina Rossetti was a very accomplished poet, as you say, very formally accomplished, and she was actually also, at the time, a very established poet. So she was recognized as a poet and she was quite successful, whereas her brother wasn't so accepted as a poet because his work, both his painting and also his writing, was considered to be too sensual, too sexual, too morally reprehensive. So in the Victorian time, paradoxically, she was actually the more accepted poet.
How did they get along somehow? Because, he was constantly breaking all the boundaries, and misbehaving somehow. And she was constantly, trying to be the Florence Nightingale type of moral person. I mean, did they get along as siblings? They did somehow, right?
Yes, but I think there is that strong note of criticism that you hear in her of what he is doing. So I really, again, I'm not an expert of Pre-Raphaelitism and all the sort of inner workings there. So I haven't read much correspondence or anything, but I don't think they would have got on particularly well, really. Because she had a completely different view. And also Dante Gabriel Rossetti became more and more eccentric. He what you read about him, he was fond of exotic animals. Wombats were sleeping on his dinner table. The wombats are, by the way, also mentioned in the among other exotic animals in Christina's poem. And he was also a drug addict, which became worse and worse in his later years, because what he took was chloral. This is a kind of substance, chloral oxide. It's a chemical substance that is solid, and that you can make a solution of it, and it works as a sedative. And he kept taking chloral diluted in whiskey. So so he was also very badly very withdrawn, and he didn't really go out much anymore in his last years. He was also very disappointed about the way that his paintings were received, and people didn't really understand what he was trying to do. So when I tell this story of the victimization of these women, of course there's another story there of also the victimization of an artist who was a male artist who was trying to do something different, and also has a European background. I mean, this is an Italian family, so he was bringing something to the British context that was a bit different and a bit alien to the usual Protestant British attitudes, and he was victimized for that as well. But for his sister, it was really not possible to go down the same road. That
of course,
for a woman, that wouldn't have been possible.
Okay, thank you. Sarah has another question.
Yes, I wanted to get your opinion on the sudden rise of religious paintings for the Pre-Raphaelites. For example, Christ in the house of his parents, or the Miracle of the Holy Father. It was not the type of paintings you would see a few years before. It's more of a sort of Renaissance sort of paintings that we would see in Italy, for example. So how do you maybe explain, or what do you think brought this sudden movement to for the Pre-Raphaelites?
Well, they wanted to, that's why they're called Pre-Raphaelites. They wanted to go back behind Raphael's paintings and to a culture that they perceived as purer somehow. And probably also, you know, I think you could make an argument about it being pre-Reformation, you know, being a kind of Catholic mysticism that makes of the religious imagery and of the religious faith a different kind of project, you know, something mystical, something to do with the development of the soul. And yeah, and they were also interested in the historical angle of the Christian religion. So you know that in the 19th century there was this debate about the actual historical Jesus, you know, and there was scholarship to do with studying early Christianity, and a picture like Christ in the house of his parents, where you have this workshop, and they're working away at the wood and so on. I think that is a side that they also wanted to bring out. Jesus as a young boy working in the workshop of his parents, and then later becoming this spiritual, this apotheosis. Then you have this picture where that is called Light of the World, where he's standing there trying to knock on a door and coming like a revelation to visit people. So I'd say it's a crypto-Catholic imagery, this turn to early and to earlier religion with medieval overtones. Yeah. Do you think that makes sense?
Yes, yeah, it completely does. Especially the first part when you talked about how they wanted to sort of get back in time to this era. It makes sense. I'm personally a lover of Renaissance, so to me that was a very good surprise when I started learning about it, which is why I'm so interested in that movement. So thank you.
Very welcome.
I'm always struck sort of by the type of realism that you have, you know, as this is of course also the time when photography was introduced, and so the people really knew what people looked like and that they could represent that. So I thought that was fascinating, and this is probably why they want to go beyond that and add this very strong symbolic, religious or mythological dimension, which I guess again anticipates modernism in many ways, you know, because the high modernists are also very much into mythological things. Maybe what is different is that it's fragmented. I have a question about Dante's painting Found, where there is an interesting kind of canon in the background, and it's sort of perspectively it's unrealistic, it's very strange. It has a kind of ground which is a sort of like white and flat or light, and
It's
then it has
unfinished.
something.
He never really finished that painting.
Oh, it's unfinished. Maybe that is the reason. Okay. And it has this weird phallic, you know, fragmented gun sort of in the background, which I couldn't really figure out. But when it's unfinished, that maybe explains a little bit, you know. Again, but what is interesting then is that some details are totally finished and very polished, and some parts are simply missing. That seems to be the way they work.
I suppose it's a sign that he was, I think, that he was grappling with that subject and that he wasn't quite able to really come to terms with it. Because he revisited that painting time and again, but he didn't ever really finish it.
Okay.
And I suppose, you know, him being interested in prostitution and in what became of women, you know, when they went down that road, basically. Maybe that was too close for comfort for him, you know, because then he would have, if you thought that through, so why is that, and what is happening to these women, and what is the reason, and what is the context, he would have probably arrived at some conclusions that he didn't want to think about.
Well, he was causally involved, obviously, in some ways, right? There would have been a sense of guilt at the end of the road, probably.
Possibly, yeah, possibly. So there is a beautiful logic to the fact that this painting is not finished.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. So Anne has a question, I see.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the talk. It was very interesting. So I knew the poem beforehand. I really like it. And I like the contrast between the siblings, him being kind of a bohemian hippie and her, this very chaste woman, portraying more the female perspective, the angel in the home, right? What the Victorians wanted. But on the same side, it's a very sensuous poem, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of like an adult version of a Dr. Seuss poem, you know, with this play on words, as Professor Ludwig already mentioned. And I also found the otherness of the goblins very interesting. So I mean, could you read it in an Orientalistic way? I mean, was that was that a subject also, because she has a lot of Oriental fruits and the exotic animals, as you mentioned. So I mean, wasn't that also the time where they where this fascination with Oriental, the Orient?
Yes, I think that's a really good idea, and it's probably for her that the language of sensualism is an Orientalist language. It kind of suggests itself as so if you want to evoke the lushness and the juiciness and the sweetness, it's the opposite of what England is in to a certain extent. So that makes a lot of sense. I think this could be pursued as a reading of the poem. And you know, I'm not saying that Christina Rossetti wasn't capable of feeling sensuality and expressing it and creating it in her language. It's just something that she didn't allow herself. She uses it in this poetry, but when Gilbert and Guba talk about the aesthetics of renunciation, I think it's very much an issue of maybe being very tempted and denying this to yourself and also to others, because of the consequences and because of a certain type of religious morality that was for the women. And but it's all there, of course. And this, you know, that they have also arguments about a kind of lesbian subtext, you know, the way that Laura then licks Lizzie and licks away all the Jews, and in a very violent and exuberant manner that happens, but only while she's being cured. Later there is a reference to she hugs her, but only once. So not many times, but only once. So they're kind of backtracking from this kind of same-sex exuberance once the cure has been effected. But it's a very, very complex poem. There is, and I don't think there's any one interpretation that can be privileged over the others. And Christina Rossetti definitely knows how to create sensuality with language and with the imagery and the fruit symbolism that she uses. Absolutely.
Well, but could we this notion of homo socialism, is that only applicable to men, to a group of men? Can we also apply that here? I mean, also further on with the children, I mean, there is no husband depicted or no father. So I mean, it's a very feminine surrounding, and they seem to get along and provide for themselves, even before the temptation or the fall.
Absolutely. I think this is something that I think it's a project that Christina Rossetti was envisaging, you know, the sisterhood, the kind of counterpart to the homosocial brotherhood, and the networks of mutual support and appreciation and so on. I think she wants to establish something similar for women. On the creative level and also on the social level, in the way that she was working with these fallen women and very practically supporting women. I think you could argue that she was, like her brother founded the Brotherhood, she is envisaging a sisterhood very strongly.
Thank you very much.
Don't you see this strategy also a little bit in the otherness of the goblins? So basically, you know, her brother has othered women all the time, and you know, projected these totally unrealistic caricatures of you know, saints women or special women or outer worldly women, sort of, you know, and then the men turn into caricatures and goblins. In
Good idea.
Christina's poem, you know.
Yes, of course.
So she's also falsifying the men and hitting back somehow, you know, with the same type of recipe, you know.
Yeah, and how they and you know, Dante buys into it. Even the illustration that he makes, this little bubble with a goblin man, you know, how they're jumping around there with their baskets.
Yeah.
So I think
falls for it.
there is a level of understanding there, I think.
Interesting. Okay, Astu has been able to ask her question. So she's asking about Elizabeth Siddal's death, you know, because she died of an addiction of laudanum. And she's saying that during that time, many people used opium as a painkiller, also for medical reasons, if that was also the case for Elizabeth and her situation, Siddal's situation.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, she was frequently in ill health, it is said. Sometimes this ill health was brought about by the sittings, you know, and like the bathtub episode and things like that. And of course, as you say, Astu, at the time, laudanum was just used for everything. And that bottle that I showed you on the slide, it's too small to really see, but there's a prescription on the bottle, you know, 3-month-old baby, 2 drops, you know. So they were giving this to babies to calm them down, and it was for any kind of cure, the toothache and all the things that these poor people were subjected to before there were painkillers, you know. So they just took this, and we know that many of the creative artists were heavily addicted to laudanum, like Coleridge, for example. He drank a whole bottle every day. So he drank that stuff by the pint, you know, when the idea was that the adult would have about 30 drops of this mixture. So it is medicinal, and it was also at the time a kind of taboo subject, that people were using this as a drug, really. So and of course, then you got, when you took this for ill health, you got into this vicious circle, because if you stop taking it, then you have withdrawal symptoms which make you ill, you know, and then you have to take it again.
Cold turkey.
Absolutely, yeah. And with Siddal, it's a tragic story, because she had a stillborn child. And she was only 32 when she died. She had a stillborn child, and there is a conjecture that perhaps the abuse of laudanum also led to that, you know, to that death of the child, and it seems that she may have been pregnant a second time, and apparently she left a suicide note that was burned. So that is what you read. So it seems that she deliberately drank the rest of the laudanum bottle that she had. Because she was also suffering from depression, partly postpartum depression at the time, because she'd had lost the baby, you know, and then the addiction and all of that. So it was probably deliberate and not just an accident. Yeah, but it's just a very frequent thing that you find. Dorothy Wordsworth also was addicted to laudanum, because she had these bad teeth. You know, when you read Dorothy Wordsworth's diaries, it's always about another tooth out and toothache today, all day, and so on, you know. And then they started taking laudanum. And it's a very powerful mixture, because the opium is dissolved in alcohol, so it's a kind of double thing, a bit like the chloral, which Dante took with whiskey. And it's an issue that we often don't understand enough, I think, to what extent the Victorian period was surfing on drugs, and how the opium preoccupation, you know, the war with China, how that kind of backfired into the heart of the empire. And you do find it, of course, in De Quincey, people who actually do write about it, or in the Moonstone, the novel by Wilkie Collins. The laudanum plays a role there. So it's really, once you start looking, it's everywhere. But it's on the other hand, it's a terrible tragedy, because you could buy this from any dispensary and just drug yourself with opium.
Yeah. That's amazing. Fascinating. Reminds me of the 60s, you know, when you thought in the 60s everybody was popping pills, you know, and actually they had very similar attitudes also, you know, and also the interaction between the sexes. We were very liberal, very free, but also very sexist at one point. Yeah, surprising similarities, I think.
Yeah.
Good. That was wonderful. Thank you for exposing us to this fascinating person, this period, this cultural aspect of women in the 19th century that is extremely important. That was great.
Very much. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is there anybody else who has a last chance for a last question? Okay, so
and
otherwise,
if you want, Sam, you can of course upload a PDF of the presentation to your
yes, they will be uploaded at the Carl-Schurz-Haus. So and I will share this.
Okay, yeah, just
And if I may, I will upload the PDF also. The PowerPoint, the slides.
Yeah, if you just transform that into a PDF, the PowerPoint, because it's got my notes in there as well. You know.
Okay, so I'll transform it into a PDF before uploading it. That's a good idea.
That would be
perfect.
Good.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Ina. That was really exciting.
Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Let's everybody give you a hand. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening.
Good stuff.